Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 42, The Bloodbath at Fontenoy. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the emperor's favoritism towards Charles and Lothar drove Louis to revolt, although it was a minor revolt compared to previous revolts. Then Pippin died. Technically, his lands should have gone to his son, also named Pippin, but the emperor decided to give Aquitaine to his son Charles. So Pippin revolted against his grandfather, and then Louis revolted again. These revolts seemed unlikely to succeed, but the elderly emperor died on his way to deal with Louis. Lothar became emperor, but decided that he did not want to divide the empire with his surviving brothers. Naturally, they insisted, which meant that there would be more conflict. Since Charles was busy dealing with Pippin, Lothar marched east to force Louis to submit. However, their followers did not want to fight each other, so there was an armistice. As ever, the key problem remained. Lothar wanted to be emperor, and his brothers did not want to bend the knee. Spring came and armies would soon start to march. Before the new emperor could deal with internal issues, he needed to handle external threats, namely Viking raids. Accepting that he could not defend the trade centers of Dorestad and Walcheren, Emperor Lothar gave them to two nephews of Harald Klak. Harald received Walcheren and Rorik received Dorestad. Admittedly, it was a bad sign that Lothar had to give up control over coastal regions, but he could now focus on his rebellious brothers. Obviously, he needed to force both of them to submit, but would move against one first. Which one? Charles was busy trying to control Aquitaine, while Louis wanted to expand his lands west across the Rhine. So Lothar led an army east in April 841. Strangely, Lothar had not used the time after the emperor's death to directly compete with Louis for control over the eastern part of the empire, making it much easier for Louis to win support. Louis even held an assembly in Saxony, the first Carolingian assembly there in 25 years. A key recruit was Abbot Warren of Corvey, head of a powerful family in the region. Warren had been a leading soldier under Emperor Louis before he entered a monastery, while his brother was a count and his sister was an abbess. The charters issued during the assembly show that Louis repeatedly praised his father and blamed his disinheritance on the emperor's evil advisors. Therefore, his claim to the region was legitimate, not a power grab. The networking in the assembly had paid off since Louis was able to gather a sizable army. However, the core problem remained. Louis was a king, but Lothar was the emperor. Whoever was emperor had access to more money and lands, which enabled Lothar to raise a larger army. Once again, Louis' nobles counted the size of the opposing army and declined to fight. Having made his point, Lothar left Adalbert of Metz to keep an eye on Louis and then marched west to deal with Charles. Adalbert's loyalty was rewarded with the title Duke of the Austrasians, although Adalbert was probably motivated by a desire to protect his lands from Louis. So, Lothar was triumphant, or at least he appeared to be, until Charles and Louis decided that they shared the same enemy and made an alliance. It is important to point out that Charles was the spoiled youngest son and thus the cause of conflict between Emperor Louis and his adult sons. If Lothar had come to terms with either Louis or Charles, the other one would have been helpless, but he was greedy and he wanted the entire empire. Or maybe it was just hardwired into his DNA at that point. While it seemed obvious that the two brothers had to cooperate against Lothar, they had been surprisingly reluctant. It would probably be an understatement to say that Louis and Charles were not fond of each other. Clearly, their respective followers had worked hard during the winter to persuade them to ally. In the end, they shared a common threat, so Charles and Louis finally agreed to join forces against Lothar. Unfortunately, it would be hard for them to work together since Lothar's lands were located between them. Either Louis or Charles would have to take the risk and march through Lothar's lands to reach his ally. Duke Adalbert's job was to keep an eye on Louis, which he did when Louis and his army marched east in May. Duke Adalbert had a larger army and blocked the key Roman road, so Adalbert undoubtedly expected that Louis would either retreat once he saw Adalbert's army or fight and be defeated. Except Louis avoided the very likely defeat and moved north to cross the Danube to enter a region composed of a dense network of streams and rivers. Adalbert had naturally pursued Louis, but Louis's strategy proved effective, and the other army was broken into smaller groups by the rivers and the lack of good roads. Seeing an opportunity, Louis turned suddenly and attacked Adalbert when he was vulnerable. The Chronicle says that much of the Austrasian army was killed, but numbers are not precise. The key point is that the army was scattered. Most important, Adalbert was killed, which completely transformed the situation. Many nobles in the region were loyal to Adalbert, who was loyal to Lothar. Once he was dead, there was no obvious replacement, and the network of supporters fell apart or was too weak to oppose Louis. While it is a bit morbid, armor taken from prisoners and from the corpses on the battlefield enabled Louis's men to arm themselves with costly swords and armor, making it a much more dangerous army. Still, Louis and Charles were separated by 250 miles since Charles was in central Frankia. Speaking of Charles, he and Lothar had spent the period of May to June 841 in a mixture of negotiation and marching to attempt to gain a superior position against the other side. At that point, both men thought that Louis was stuck in Bavaria, so Charles was left to face Lothar alone, but even so, neither side had a decisive advantage. The balance had changed by mid-June since Judith arrived with reinforcements from Aquitaine, and Louis suddenly appeared with a small but well-trained army. Louis's men had marched 430 miles in 3 weeks to link up with Charles, which is roughly 20 miles a day, an impressive accomplishment. No disrespect to the stamina of Louis's troops, but the key point is that they had marched across much of the empire unopposed. Emperor Lothar either lacked supporters in the region where Louis marched, or had already drawn all of his supporters to face Charles, since he was unable to block Louis. On paper, Charles and Louis's alliance of brotherly love would enable them to defeat Lothar, but their men were reluctant to kill fellow Franks. While the bloody expansionist campaigns had ended decades earlier, there had been enough revolts and local feuds that the nobles were not afraid to fight. They were just not sure who they wanted to fight for. As a result, Charles and Louis attempted to negotiate, offering Lothar a third of the empire, although they knew that Lothar would probably not accept the offer. So the question is, why didn't Charles and Louis force a battle while they still had the advantage of numbers? The likely answer is that some of their nobles still needed to be convinced that there was no other option. Another possibility is that they could not make Lothar stand and fight, and they wanted a decisive battle. Negotiations proved futile since Lothar was waiting for his new ally, Pippin II of Aquitaine, who arrived on June 24th. He did not come by himself, but he brought an army. Apparently, the combined army was large enough that Lothar decided that he was willing to risk losing everything for the chance of winning the entire empire. So there would be a battle at Fontenoy on June 25th. Again, it is necessary to stress that the battle was not merely the result of a sibling rivalry. The leaders on both sides were able to convince their respective followers that the alternative to battle was worse. Clearly, enough nobles accepted that they would lose their lands if the other side became supreme, and they were willing to risk their lives to avoid that outcome. It is important to point out that the Franks had not fought each other since Charles the Hammer had led an Austrasian army against the rival mayor of Nuestria over a century earlier. Since then, the Franks have been united in external expansion. The repeated showdowns and battles between Emperor Louis and his sons had all been resolved peacefully or with relatively few deaths. Honestly, the brothers and their supporters may have thought that the other side would blink when faced with a large army. Nearly every major noble in the Frankish Empire took part in the clash at Fontenoy, except for one, Bernard of Septimania, who would have been expected to join Lothar and Pippin against Charles, but did not arrive in time. Most likely, he delayed on purpose to see who would win. The armies organized themselves with Louis' experienced Bavarians in the center facing Lothar, Charles faced Pippin, and Charles's supporter Count Adalard led the remaining wing. The battle in the center was decisive. Lothar was apparently personally brave, but Louis' men had been hardened by repeated battles and had stuck with him despite repeated defeats. So his well-armed men slowly carved their way forward until Lothar's men broke. Charles and Adalard both won their respective battles, but the key factor was likely Lothar's defeat. The death toll was heavy, in the thousands, but none of the key leaders had died, so the civil war would continue. However, Lothar was struggling to survive while Louis had won 2 major victories in a row. Nobles would think twice about openly opposing him in the future. Also, Lothar had fled the battlefield, leaving behind his baggage train, so Louis and Charles could arm more of their men with expensive swords and armor. Moreover, the baggage train contained an unexpected prize, the Archbishop of Ravenna, and a massive quantity of gold and jewels intended to bribe Lothar to arrange for the Archbishopric of Ravenna to become independent of Rome once he became emperor. Instead, Charles and Louis were able to reward their loyal followers with the bribe money. Lothar had fled after losing the battle, so many of his supporters in Western Frankia accepted that they would have to come to terms with Charles. Actually, Charles still had a problem, Pippin II. So Charles listened to an offer from Bernard of Septimania. If Charles would confirm the lands of Bernard's eldest son William in Burgundy, Bernard would help defeat Pippin. Charles agreed, and William became a hostage. However, few other nobles proved willing to join Charles's army, so he failed to intimidate Pippin. After pointless marching, Charles went north to meet with his nobles in the region. Again, he had a small army, so few nobles appeared to meet him. Admittedly, they did not revolt. They just did not rush to pledge loyalty, which was a worrying sign. One of the few nobles who did present himself was Abbot Hugh, an illegitimate brother of the deceased Emperor Louis. Honestly, the key question was whether or not the nobles in the western part of the empire remained loyal to Lothar. The question was soon answered, since Lothar marched into western Frankia, where he attempted to forge an alliance with Neustrians, Bretons, and Pippin of Aquitaine. Charles avoided battle and tried to negotiate with his brother while observing the behavior of his new followers. Either they were tired of war, or realized that Lothar would not win, or preferred Charles, or some combination of these factors. Regardless, none rejoined Lothar, so he had to retreat after wasting the winter trying to lure his former supporters. Returning to eastern Frankia, Louis had received numerous vows of fealty, although he likely suspected their sincerity. As a result, he must have been relieved when Lothar attempted to cross the Rhine in August 841, but attracted little support and was soon driven off. In fact, he failed to prevent Charles and Louis from meeting in early 842 and renewing their alliance with the Strasbourg Oaths on February 14th, nearly 8 months after the decisive battle at Fontenoy. A record of the oaths has survived and reveals that the nobles sworn to both brothers were tired of the civil war and did not want another battle. So the oaths were explicitly intended to reassure them that the war would soon end. It is worth pointing out that the kings spoke in different languages to their men, recognizing that there was no common language in the Frankish Empire. Therefore, it is clear that they had summoned leading followers from all of their regions to ensure that they had complete support. It is doubtful that either Louis or Charles had much interest in consensus, but they were realists and knew that Lothar would happily exploit any divisions among their followers, so a united front was essential. Observing the brothers' armies, many Saxon nobles swore allegiance to Louis, and Louis was even reinforced by more Bavarians led by his 12-year-old son Charlemagne, showing everyone that he had an heir. The enlarged army then marched south to face Lothar, who was forced to retreat to Aachen and drain the treasury to bribe nobles to support him. By late March, Lothar had been forced to flee to Burgundy. This bloodless victory ended the struggle between the brothers. Lothar simply could not oppose his brothers if they remained united. So he sent envoys to negotiate with the envoys of Charles and Louis, and this time the negotiations would be real. However, the brothers did not have the time to leisurely make a detailed division of the empire, since the lengthy concentration of their armies had left them vulnerable in their own lands. So once the brothers had agreed on a rough three-way division of the empire, they basically adjourned to spend the rest of the summer dealing with internal issues. It is worth pointing out that the three brothers had different goals. Lothar had been named co-emperor by his father, so he wanted to become emperor. Louis and Charles simply wanted to be kings of very large kingdoms. So, what was happening with the neighbors? Or, more accurately, why didn't any of the neighbors invade? In August 842, emissaries from Constantinople met with Lothar and arranged that Lothar's eldest son, 17-year-old Louis of Italy, would marry the daughter of Emperor Theophilus. The marriage alliance was an actual alliance, since Louis of Italy was expected to join an attack on the Muslims in southern Italy. This was an important alliance, but unknown to the emissaries. Theophilus had died suddenly of dysentery by the time they met with Lothar. Although Theophilus was succeeded by his 2-year-old son Michael, with his mother Theodora as regent, the Eastern Empire would understandably focus on internal stability in the near future. What about the Emirate of Cordoba? Abd al-Rahman II had been ruling for 2 decades by this time. While it was undoubtedly pleasant to follow news of the chaos north of the Pyrenees, the emir seems to have accepted that he lacked the resources needed to retake Barcelona, never mind invade or even raid Aquitaine. Instead, Abd al-Rahman took advantage of the dysfunction within the Frankish Empire to strengthen his control over the more restive parts of the emirate. In addition, he created a civil service with the departments of finance, interior, defense, and economic development. Stability in trade enabled the emirate to prosper, and the population of Cordoba grew to 75,000 during his reign. In short, the empire still lacked a rival that was a genuine threat. To sum up, Charles and Louis made an alliance against Lothar, but appeared unable to link up, until Louis lured Lothar's main supporter in the east into a trap and killed him. Moving quickly, Louis and his army joined up with Charles several weeks later. Still, Lothar was supported by his nephew Pippin, so the two sides appeared evenly matched when they faced each other at Fontenoy. The battle was a bloodbath, and Lothar was forced to flee. None of the key leaders had died, so it seemed that the struggle would continue. Actually, it wouldn't. Fontenoy had been the first large-scale battle between Franks in a century, and none of the nobles in the empire had any desire to repeat the experience. Most important, Charles and Louis remained united, so Lothar accepted that he would have to negotiate with his brothers. However, detailed negotiations would have to wait until the brothers had dealt with internal issues in their respective territories. I will discuss those internal issues and the final treaty between the brothers next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.